Welcome to chapter 12a of invertebrates. This chapter is actually going to be really interesting. We're going to talk about different animals, the phylums that they're classified under. We're going to talk about how they, move, what they eat, what their structures are made out of, what they use for self-defense. And you'll notice that a lot of these animals you already know. So you're going to kind of learn about their more scientific names and then compare it to the names that you may know them in a day-to-day kind of life. So the first 12a section we're going to talk about is pretty much what the animal kingdom is. So when we talk about the animal kingdom, if you look at my beautiful lion drawing just for you guys, the study of animals is basically called zoology. And this is basically when you talk about animals and you realize that animals are all multicellular, which means that they are eukaryotic for the most part, or they are all eukaryotic, and they have tissues that are organized. So if you guys remember that we talked about the organization of tissues, I mean that we all have cells, and then those cells are organized into tissues. Those tissues are organized into organs. Those organs are organized into organ systems, and so on and so forth. Another important thing is that, the animals are consumers, meaning that they do not make their own food like plants. Plants use photosynthesis to make their own food, but they consume other animals, they consume plants, and therefore they need other ways of getting food. So continuing with zoology, animals have something called life cycles, all right, which means that it starts when they are born and then it ends with, so it starts when they're born and then it ends with when they are, finally perished and they die. And then an animal is going to also develop pretty complex organs that will, start to develop as they start to grow. And then these organs are going to help them from consuming food to being able to reproduce, to make more life forms so that they can pass on from one generation to another. And then the way that they reproduce is mostly sexually, but there are some animals that do produce asexually, and then we will also talk about that. So invertebrate, all right, so what is an invertebrate? An invertebrate is pretty much an animal that has no backbone, so without a backbone. An example of this is my little starfish right here on the upper right corner. And another example are earthworms, all right? So earthworms, if you've ever picked up one as a kid or just seen how it moves on the ground, you can tell that there is no actual skeleton like we have. And same thing with the starfish, they have different materials that make up what we call a skeleton. And those materials are, we'll get into what they're actually made up of. So they're not actually made up of bones like we do, but different things. And then this skeleton that they have helps them with the shape of their body. It helps keep their muscles have a place that they can attach to so that they can help with movement and proper structure. So an example of the starfish and earthworm is that starfish, they have an endoskeleton, which means that it's on the inside. The endo part means that they are on the inside of the animal, and then exo means that they are on the outside. So endo means they are on the inside, and then exo means they're on the outside. For a starfish though, the endoskeleton which is on the inside, is made of something called the calcium carbonate plates. And then these are also known as ossicles, which I have down here. And the starfish's exoskeleton, the skeleton on the outside, there's no specific names for them, but sometimes they have like a harder, like spikes and stuff on the outside. That gives them protection and just to give them a form of structure as well. Earthworms, on the other hand, they have no exoskeleton. So they have no actual skeleton on the outside of their body that is going to prevent them from being squished or give them an extra layer of protection. But they do have an endoskeleton, and remember that I said that this was on the inside. Okay, and this inside skeleton is something called hydrostatic skeleton. All right, which basically means that the muscles that they have on the inside are going to be filled with a layer of fluid, hence the hydrostatic part, and that's going to give them that ability to kind of form or conform to any kind of position or kind of form that they need to be so that they can move more easily and stuff like that. Okay, so earthworms, like my earthworm buddy that I drew over here, they have this hydrostatic skeleton. And they have no exoskeleton. All right, so other invertebrates that we talk about, they have also skeleton that can either be internal or external, and they are made up of materials like I have written here, glass, something similar to like glass, limestone, protein, water, and like we said, the earthworm in the previous one has something that's similar to the water, the hydrostatic skeleton. And then they also have various shapes and sizes that they come in because of these exo and endoskeletons, or internal and external skeletons. And so like the butterfly, sea slugs, crabs, they all look different. They all have different forms of internal and external skeletons. All right, I'm gonna fit 12B into this as well because it is 12A is a lot shorter, and I know that you guys have more time this week to work on both sections. This is my fun drawing of SpongeBob and his pet Gary that I drew for you guys. Hope you enjoy it. I had a lot of fun drawing it. But basically SpongeBob is going to represent my sponges, and Gary is just his awesome best friend. So he's just gonna hang out with us too. So the sponge is also called porifera. Okay, so this is another name for sponges, porifera, which basically means it is a pore bearer. Okay, pore bearer, porifera. This is the phylum that we use to call our sponges. And all this means is that this animal has a lot of pores. Like you saw SpongeBob in my previous slide, he has a lot of pores, right? And that's how water is gonna go in and out of the body. It's how water is gonna get pumped in and out. And the water is super important as it goes in and out of the sponge because the water is carrying essential food, oxygen, and it's gonna also help get rid of waste from the plant because sponges are okay, so we know that most sponges live in the ocean. And there's something unique about an adult sponge versus an embryonic sponge. An adult sponge, okay, are sessile. So that means that they do not actually move. They're permanently attached to a solid object, okay? And then embryonic sponges, on the other hand, they're not sessile. That means they do move. They're able to float through the ocean. And that's how you have sponges that are able to grow away from the parent that they came from and able to take ground in a different spot than right where they were birthed, pretty much. And sponges actually do mostly reproduce by sexual reproduction, and then there are very few sponges that reproduce asexually, but for the most part they reproduce sexually. Some sponges have skeletons that are made out of something called spongin, which is basically a flexible fibrous protein. And then, so you might see them kind of be able to move with the water a little bit. And then some of them have spicules, which is basically little spikes that come out of the sponge. And those spicules or those spikes are made out of calcium carbonate or silica. All right. And then some sponges have both spongin and spicules. And I have some diagrams that I will show you what that looks like. So for this diagram, you can see we have a sponge here. And then you can see the spicule that I have highlighted right here. And that looks like a little kind of spike looking thing. And that's pretty much what some, sponges have. Not all of them, but some of them do. And then the body of the sponge acts like a pump. Okay, so this is really important. It acts like a pump. And the reason that sponges have so many pores is because they allow for water to come through, carrying that food, oxygen, and carry away waste. So a sponge also has something called a central cavity, which is basically the main cavity that's right in the middle of the sponge. And at the top of the sponge, there is an opening. The central cavity is going to be lined all around with something called collar cells. And those collar cells are going to have something called flagella. Remember how we talked about flagella is kind of looks like a tail that's used for movement. So sperms have flagellas at the end of them. And there are also other cells that might have 1 or 2 or 3 flagella or more. And the important part of the flagella that's going to be in the collar cells is that they are going to help move the water through the central cavity and to exit at the top. So this is a good way for waste to be excreted from the sponge, and then also to help the nutrients and oxygen kind of go throughout the entire sponge. So like I said, we have our central cavity right here, which is pretty much this entire thing. You have the opening. Oops, I'll use a different color. You have the opening at the top right here. And then you have your collar cell. So this whole entire thing is your collar cell. And you can see that the collar cell has a flagella right here. And you can see that they are, right here, they're kind of like implemented into the central cavity of the sponge itself. Okay, so this right here is a zoomed up version of what is going on right here. All right. Okay, so sponges are often called filter feeders. All right, so that's pretty important. And you can probably understand from what I just said that water comes in, and that's how they get the food. So they filter out the food. And then the food is captured by, oops, this is supposed to say collar cells. All right, so the food is filtered by the collar cells. Let me write that a little bit more neatly. All right, and the cells, these collar cells are going to absorb also the oxygen that they need from the water, and then they're also going to release the waste that the sponge itself makes. Another thing to note is that the inner and outer wall of the sponge is also going to have a jelly-like layer, and this is what is going to help transport the food and other materials like oxygen in and out of the sponge. Okay, let's talk about the jellyfish, also known as the cnidarian. Yes, the C is silent, so it's pronounced cnidarian, not cnidarian or cnidarian. It's called the cnidarian. So the jellyfish's phylum is the cnidarian. I drew a beautiful jellyfish for you guys. Most of these jellyfish, also known as cnidarians, live in the ocean. There are some jellyfish that you can find in fresh water if you go by like rivers and lakes and look over the dock, you can see some jellyfish. And the jellyfish also have a central cavity like the sponge, and they're going to be surrounded by 2 thin tissue layers, and that 2 tissue layers are going to be separated by this jelly-like material. And you probably know that the jellyfish have tentacles, right? And these tentacles are not probably something you want to get tangled up in because they have stinging cells. And these stinging cells are kind of a protective layer around the mouth, but also this is how they capture their prey to eat them. And this is also used as a self-defense mechanism that we will talk about. So the jellyfish have also a thing called radial symmetry. Basically, this means that they can be divided into halves that are equal by any plane along the length of the organism. So if you look at my hydra here, this diagram, you can see that there are these planes that are pretty much cutting this hydra into equal parts, and this is called radial symmetry. All right, that the fact that I can split this hydra into equal parts. The same thing can be done for a jellyfish. Okay, So a jellyfish has a general body shapes, all right? So there are two main body shapes. There is the umbrella-shaped jellyfish, which you see up here, and that's called the medusa, all right? And then there's something called a tubular shape, which is like a polyp. Example, like the hydra that we saw in the slide before. Oops, no. Oop. I'm going way ahead of myself. Okay, so this is the hydra that we saw. This is like a polyp, and basically the tubular polyp, what happens is that it just stays in one spot. Okay, so if you can see, my polyp is kind of like on a rocky thing, and it just stays there, and it's not sessile. That means it doesn't move, and they reproduce sexually, or they can also, some of them, reproduce asexually. The main support for the jellyfish is going to be the jelly-like mass that's filling between those two tissue layers, and this makes them have a hydrostatic skeleton like the earthworm, and then this is going to be and the hydrostatic skeleton itself is supported by that jelly-like substance that's inside of them between the two tissue layers. Like I said, the body wall of the jellyfish is made up of those two layers of tissues. Inside layer of the jellyfish is called the gastrovascular cavity. This is pretty much like the central cavity, and this is where the jellyfish is going to be digesting the food that it consumes, okay? It's also called external digestion, and then there are going to be digestive enzymes that are going to be located inside of this gastrovascular cavity to help consume the food. And then the jellyfish also has a bunch of nerves and muscle fibers that are going to help function with the jellyfish itself, but the jellyfish does not have a brain tissue, all right? So it cannot process thoughts or things like that. So I have two types of jellyfish here. So I have right here is the medusa, and you can see that this stuff right in the center here is the gastrovascular cavity, which is where the food is going to be digested. It has the mouth and anus in the same location right here. You can see the tentacles that are coming out right here from the sides of the jellyfish around its mouth. And then you can see the polyp up here, which also has a gastrovascular cavity that's in the middle. And then it also has a mouth and anus at the top, and then it also has tentacles that come out around the mouth and body. Okay, so like I said before, jellyfish have a defense and movement mechanisms. So there's something called nematocytes, which are basically the stingers that I talked about that you don't want to get tangled up in. And these nematocytes are going to be found, which are stingers, are going to be found in the special cells that are going to be on the outer layer of the jellyfish. And I have a picture to show you, so it'll make sense. Just hang in with me here. And these tentacles that have these special cells with the stingers, they're going to have a trigger, okay? They're all going to have a trigger. Once that trigger is triggered, it's going to cause a thin tube to be forced out of the nematocyte, and it's going to penetrate the other organism. That's when you feel the sting, all right? Now, the main function of these stingers is actually to get food, all right? But if you're harming that jellyfish and it feels threatened, yeah, it's going to use it as a defense mechanism, all right? So people avoid jellyfish tentacles because of the painful stings that's inflicted by these nematocytes. And these nematocytes can contain poison, which can cause, for humans, it can cause us pretty bad rashes that can really hurt for a while. And then for small animals, it can actually kill them, and that way they can digest them. Okay, so here I have a jellyfish, and you can see that once I zoom in to these tentacles, right, I'm gonna get this picture up here, which you can see the tentacles zoomed in, and I'm gonna zoom in even further, and you're gonna see that on the tentacle there is a special cell And that special cell is what is going to contain the coiled thread, which is going to be the stinger, as well as a trigger. That trigger is what, if something touches it or if it feels threatened, that is going to, in response, cause the nematocyte, which is the stringer itself, to release the coiled thread. So the thread is going to discharge, and then it will attach to a prey, and then the prey will either die and it will be able to digest it, or get severely hurt. And this is something that is just important for the jellyfish to have for protection. So make sure that you are not getting tangled up in the jellyfish. Swim the other way if you do see one. So how does the jellyfish move? The Medusa, which is like the jellyfish that can move, it's going to swim by contracting the muscles that it has around the rim of its body. And then it's also going to kind of squirt out water or jet out water from the gastrovascular cavity. And this is going to move the jellyfish forward. Okay, so it's kind of going to go out, the water is going to come out in jets and cause the jellyfish to move forward. And it will also use the tentacles and the muscles around the actual rim of its body to move. Hydras, corals, sea anemones, and Portuguese man-of-wars are also different types of cnidarians. Sea anemones, you probably, saw in Nemo, where that's where they live in. The clownfish don't actually get injured by them. And Nemo does a very cute job of trying to pronounce sea anemones. And then Portuguese man-of-wars, I'm going to talk about in the next couple slides. It's really interesting, very dangerous, so please do not go near one if you see one. But each of these animals are going to capture their prey because of the ability for their tentacles to have these stingers on them. And then they'll be able to digest them in their central body cavity. So I feel like a lot of people underestimate jellyfish and Portuguese man-of-wars and other cnidarians because of the way that they kind of don't have any brain tissue. So they're kind of like, oh, they're just dumb creatures. But they are also gifted with the ability to protect themselves and have a way to capture food and eat it. Portuguese man-of-war, like I mentioned, they are actually really dangerous. They can cause some intense pain in humans, and there have been cases where humans have died by the stings and how much stings that these Portuguese man-of-war have caused. So really crazy. So these are pictures of Portuguese man-of-war. You can see at the top left picture, they are beautiful, right? But they are very, very dangerous. They kind of look like, I don't even know, kind of like a dying bird or something, I don't know, or a slug that's just floating. So usually in water, what happens is that these Portuguese man-of-war, they kind of just float. They fill up with air and they kind of just float at the top, and then they have these tentacles that just drop down. People get and they can go, these tentacles can actually go down to 50 feet. So you can imagine that if you're swimming and you're not really paying attention and you get entangled in one of these, how it can actually kill you. So very dangerous.